I'm Kamy Akhavan, and I'm the Managing Director of the USC Dornsife Center for the Political Future. Welcome to all of you who joined in the room today, and those of you who are watching on Zoom, those of you who are watching on Facebook Live, those of you who are watching on recorded video on YouTube, and those of you who are listening on the Let's Find Common Ground podcast, welcome. Today I'm joined by acclaimed activists Shannon Watts and Benji Backer, whose organizations have mobilized millions to push for social change. I'll introduce them now. First, Shannon Watts. Shannon Watts is a mother of 5 who, prior to founding Moms Demand Action, was a stay-at-home mom and former communications executive. The day after the Sandy Hook shooting, Shannon posted on Facebook that all Americans can and should do more to reduce gun violence. That online conversation turned into a grassroots movement that has implemented dozens of gun safety reforms nationally and protected people from gun violence. Moms Demand Action has established a chapter in every state of the country and is part of Every Town for Gun Safety, the largest gun violence prevention organization in the country with nearly 11 million supporters. Her latest book, Fired Up: How to Turn Your Spark into a Flame and Come Alive at Any Age, has become an immediate bestseller. She was also an outstanding fellow at the Center for the Political Future. Welcome back to USC.
Thank you.
Shannon, real quick, you had a very early start with your political identity. You don't know that I'm going to ask you this, but my question is, can you tell us the very first complete sentence that you created, which was political?
Yes. Actually, my parents taught it to me. It was, Nixon lied to the people. I was 3. Yeah.
First said, Nixon lied to the people. Love that. Ladies and gentlemen, Shannon Watts. All right. Now, Benji Backer is the founder and CEO of Nature is Nonpartisan, a movement redefining the environment as a nonpartisan issue once and for all. He is the founder of the American Conservation Coalition, ACC, the country's largest conservative environmental organization, which he founded during his freshman year of college. He's best-selling author of The Conservative Environmentalist, Common Sense Solutions for a Sustainable Future. Benji has been named a New York Times Changemaker and awarded the Fortune Under 40, Forbes 30 Under 30, Green Biz 30 Under 30, and the Grist 50. His current organization, by the way, Nature is Nonpartisan, was founded earlier this year in the geographic center of the United States, which is?
Any guesses? South Dakota.
South Dakota, Belfort, South Dakota. Their nonpartisan goal, make America beautiful again. Benji, you also started your political life very early, and you also don't know that I'm going to ask you this, but can you tell us briefly about your phone banking for presidential candidate John McCain when you were 12 years old?
I was 10 years old, actually. I was on crutches. I was in theater and in sports. Couldn't do either one because I was on crutches. And I watched the debate. My parents weren't active in politics at all. And I was like, I want to go make phone calls for this guy. And they were like, that is so weird. And so they drove me down to the Victory Center, the campaign center, and I made 20,000 phone calls over the course of 4 months, and my voice hadn't even changed yet. So people were like, who the heck is this 10-year-old calling me? So that's where it all started.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Benji Backer. All right.
Thank you.
Now, though Watts is a Democrat, Backer is a Republican, both have turned their passion for change toward causes that transcend partisanship. Today's conversation is part of the Dialogue Across Difference series, made possible in part thanks to funding secured with help from former USC President Dr. Carol Foulds. We will leave some time for your questions at the end of our initial conversation, so think of questions now. Let's go ahead and get started. My first question is for you, Shannon. It's about your book, Fired Up: How to Turn Your Spark into a Flame. It became a New York Times best-selling book immediately after publication. It received an impossibly high 4.6 rating on Amazon. The Bible has a 4.8. So clearly the reception has been strong. Congratulations on your success. Why did you write this book, and why is it important for people, especially women, to read it?
Yeah, I was involved in gun violence prevention for 11 years. And as you said, I started after the Sandy Hook school shooting tragedy in 2012. For those of you who either don't remember or weren't alive during that horrific tragedy, it really rocked the world of so many mothers in this country that 20 children and 6 educators could be slaughtered in the sanctity of an elementary school. And what I realized during my activism was, I started Moms Demand Action. I was 41 years old at the time. I had never been politically active. I had worked in the corporate world. And for me, when I started the organization, something in me came alive. And I watched that happen to so many other women as well. There's something about aligning your values, your abilities, and your desires. And when those things come together, it's like alchemy, right? It's like touching the divine. And that's how I felt every day as a full-time volunteer for 11 years, doing that work. And what I realized was that I was watching other women, I was helping them walk through that door as well, right? Figuring out what their values, abilities, and desires were. And maybe they came into the organization because their kid had to go through a lockdown drill, or there was a shooting in their family or their community. And then suddenly they realized what their values, abilities, and desires were, and it really kind of opened up a new world for them. And many of them went on to run for office. Many of our volunteers are now in school boards, city councils, even members of Congress. Some of them left marriages, some of them left jobs, some of them went back to school, they started their own organizations. And, I'm almost 55 years old. My mom was expected to disappear in middle age, right? That generation, the boomer generation, for women, you raised kids and then you sort of faded into the background. I'm part of the wealthiest, healthiest generation that has ever existed. And we have a whole second half of our lives to live. And I don't care if your passion is personal, political, professional. I want women to keep doing that till the very end.
Mm.
Well, if they read this book, they'll be on their way. So thank you for that. I'll have follow-up questions for you, but before I get into them, I wanted to ask you, Benji, a similar question, which is your book, The Conservative Environmentalist, Common Sense Solutions for a Sustainable Future, was also received great acclaim on publication. As of last week, it was a number 11 book on energy policy on Amazon. It's number 6 on Kindle.
It's good to hear. I didn't even know that. It came out a year and a half ago, so.
It's very strong. Arnold Schwarzenegger called it, and it's right on the cover, he called it an essential read. Van Jones called it a critical blueprint and an indispensable resource. What an amazing reception. Why did you write this book?
Well, I wrote it because I wanted to destigmatize the word conservative and the word environmentalist. People on the right, but it ended up just having the opposite effect, I think. People were like, oh, it says the word environmentalist. I can't buy that. I'm a conservative. Or liberals saw it and they're like, I can't buy that. It says, what I don't like. And so both sides didn't really like something about it. But the whole point is, and this is actually something that you probably don't want me to share. 10 years ago, she and I got into battle on Twitter with each other, okay?
I blocked him.
And she blocked me, all right? And I just remembered that when I looked at her profile. And now we're like fast friends. And I think what I've come to the realization of over the last decade, and I think you have too in your own way, is that the boxes that we put ourselves in politically in this country are totally wrong. And they want us to be in these two boxes where you either need to fit over here or you need to fit over here. And the reality is we share a lot of the same values. I'm sure a lot of the people in this room share a lot of overlap in the Venn diagram. And when I wrote this book, I wanted to create a different alternative blueprint for conservation in the environment. But I knew that we couldn't just do it with only one side at the table. And that if we wanted to get good environmental policy done, it had to be across party lines. So yes, you can be a conservative environmentalist. Yes, you can be a liberal environmentalist. You can be a conservative that drives a Prius or a liberal that drives a Ford F-350. Like, we have to get out of these boxes if we're going to solve these problems. And so trying to destigmatize the environmental movement for conservatives is something that's really important, but not because it's about conservative versus liberal, because this is one of, sort of like gun safety, is one of the few issues that Americans actually share across party lines. And, having clean water, clean air, having healthy forests, healthy habitat doesn't, none of that cares about if a Republican or the Democrat is in the White House. It needs to be protected and conserved no matter who is there. And in American history, we have proven that that's possible. Richard Nixon signed some of the biggest environmental policies of all time. And he didn't do it because he was this big tree-hugging lover. He did it because he knew it was popular in America. And we need to create that movement again so that neither side can afford to not solve environmental problems, because these things should transcend party lines. That's why I called the book The Conservative Environmentalist, and that's why we launched Nature as Nonpartisan earlier this year.
I appreciate those remarks. To your point, you mentioned Nixon. In your book, you talked about Teddy Roosevelt, you talked about President Reagan, you talked about George H.W. Bush, about George W. Bush, and about Governor Schwarzenegger. And at one point, you cited the statistic that, and maybe remind me what it was, what percentage of people identified as environmentalists?
80% of Americans in 1990 self-identified as environmentalists. Today, it's 38%. So we have unnecessarily put the environment in the culture wars and hated each other over it, when in reality, the Prius driver and the person who spends their weekends hunting and fishing actually want the exact same thing. They want to preserve and conserve nature for future generations. And until we stand together, instead of in our separate silos in those boxes that people want us to be in, that the algorithm wants us to be in, we're going to continue to see the problems that we're seeing.
Well, to break this cycle of polarization that seems to be getting worse, not better, Shannon, you talk about desires, values, abilities. We have the desire, we have the values, and we have the abilities. And there's a lot of books that try to activate people. You've focused on those three things, and you talked a little bit about them. I'm eager to hear more about why those three things. And I'll say that, and I'll add this to the question because I thought it was so interesting when you brought this up. But there are traps that people get into when they start thinking about what they can achieve. And some of those traps you mentioned as purpose, happiness, and achievement. And I'm hoping you can talk a little bit more about the pitfalls of the hyper focus on those things and the benefits of thinking about it more broadly about desires, values, and abilities.
Yeah, I think that when you get involved in activism, there's a myriad of things that you can do, right? We're talking here about whether things can be partisan or bipartisan, and how do you choose what it is that lights you up and what you want to get involved in. When I was teaching here, I would have so many students and particularly young women come up to me and say, my parents expect me to be an engineer or a lawyer or a doctor, and that's not necessarily the path that I want to go down. And so I think it's important to think about what is it that you want to do, but also how can you give back, right? Alice Walker, the poet and author, says, activism is a rent I pay to live on the planet. And I think we all have a role to play. And I don't think that, especially women, right? We hold about 25% of the 500,000 elected positions in this country. That is why, the saying is, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu. And so often women's freedoms and safety are on the menu. And it's often because we don't hold those positions of power. We're only about less than 5% of Fortune 1000 CEOs. So we do have to use our voices, and we do have to use our votes, in addition to whatever it is, the career path that we want to go down. And I think the best formula for that is, again, looking at your values, abilities, and desires. Those things change throughout your life, right? When I started Moms Demand Action, my values, because I had little kids, were protecting my families and my community. But I'm older now, and so I have a different set of values. Abilities is a more interesting one. I often work with women, again, thousands and thousands of activists who don't really realize what their abilities are. And they downplay them. I think women are sort of expected to downplay what it is that they're good at. And so I have a whole exercise in the book where I ask you to list your abilities, and that includes everything, right? Like, have you thrown a really good kid's birthday party? It's all executive functioning. But then more importantly, go ask someone who loves you, a family member, a friend, what they think your abilities are. Because that's where I think you will start to have your eyes open, and then you have that list to remind you of what you're capable of. And look, a lot of abilities are not innate, they're acquired, so then you can go get the abilities you need to figure out what it is that you want to do. And when I think about my abilities, I was a corporate communications executive. I knew how to create a brand. I knew how to develop messaging. That helped Moms Demand Action feel very credible within weeks of starting the organization. And my desire, I was a kid of the 80s, and so I saw Mothers Against Drunk Driving make such incredible change in under a decade. And I thought, we need a Mothers Against Drunk Driving to stand up for gun safety, to stand up against the gun lobby. And so that was my desire, was really to stand shoulder to shoulder with a badass army of women. But I do think, I want to go back to Benji's point about polarization. There is this idea in this country that gun safety, you're either on the side of guns or you're not. And actually 90% of Americans support stronger gun laws. We have 400 million guns in this country. We're never going to get rid of the guns. We have a Second Amendment. That's not happening. But what we can have are background checks. We can keep guns out of the hands of domestic abusers. And I think values, abilities, and desires can also guide you to have conversations with people who don't share or you don't think share your views. And, Benji said something to me like, people would think it was really strange that he was here with me, because I have been demonized, by the right. Like, I am seen as this lady who's going to come to your house and take your guns. And nothing could be further from the truth. You cannot have any movement in this country unless it's bipartisan. If we only have Democrats who support gun safety, we're never going to have gun safety laws, So I think as you think about what your values, abilities, and desires are, I just want to underline the point that it's more crucial now to have conversations with people who you may think have different ideas and opinions than you do.
Yeah. Love the advice, and I wanted to pivot because I do want to talk more about partisanship, and I have a question specifically focusing on that. But before we get into that, I also wanted to ask a little bit about the role of government in all of this. Because Benji, in your book, the common sense solutions come from their market-based approaches. They're talking about entrepreneurial spirit. They're talking about reducing government barriers to greater efficiency, about innovation. Why do you think that markets, entrepreneurs, innovators, what can they do for the environment that government cannot do?
Well, it's a really good question. I think most people would understand that there needs to be a balance between them all. Like, it's not just the government or it's not just markets and innovation. It's all of it. And I think for too long, similar to just politics in general, it's been one or the other. You either just do free market and you can just exploit, or you have to put a barrier over everything and make it really hard to do anything. And if there's a fire in a national park, you can't fight it because the government has too many barriers to go and fight it. So there has to be a balance between those. So I tried to over-focus a little bit in the book about the markets just to help people understand what value they can bring, but not to say that it's the only way forward. And the reality is things just happen faster in the marketplace. I don't really want to trust a government that's run by Marjorie Taylor Greene and AOC to solve my problems right now, okay? So if I was trying to solve something, I would tell people, go start a business to go and solve it, because you can raise capital, you can move fast, you can deploy things, and the biggest environmental achievements throughout history came in partnership with the marketplace. The Toyota Prius really single-handedly helped get us on a path to more lower emissions vehicles and actually EVs. And it came out of Japan saying, hey, car makers, let's make the most fuel-efficient car out there because people want to save money at the gas pump. And because they inspired this innovation, then you had Toyota compete and figure out next-generation technology. So technology can play a really strong role. But the government does have to make sure that we have clean air, clean water, and doesn't allow people to just pollute. And so it's that balance. And I think it goes back to what you're saying, 90% of people want more, common sense gun safety. 90% of Americans, 95% of Americans want clean air, clean water, and want the government to be involved in that, and want the markets to be involved in that, and want a balanced approach. But that's not being represented at the national dialogue anymore. And we've become so polarized that we have this underbelly of alignment that no one realizes. And I've spent the last 8 years traveling the country. I've been to almost every state at least 5 times. So I've spent time in the most rural places in Mississippi and Alabama. I grew up in Wisconsin. I lived in Seattle. I've seen the whole country, and the alignment is there. And I think you can speak to this too. And yet that's not being reflected. So we have to create a movement that shows politicians that we want a balanced approach to these issues, that we want common sense gun safety, that we want common sense environmentalism, and that we actually demand it. And right now they feel like they can just get away with dividing us. And so I actually don't like when it's like the markets or the government. It's like, no, we need both, because sometimes the markets make sense and sometimes the government does. But the government does get in the way when it doesn't allow us to go in and manage ecosystems. The tribes, the native tribes in America have done an amazing job of conservation throughout history, and it was active management. And when the government puts a wall around nature and says you can't go in and actively manage it, it's going against science, and that's the government being overbearing. But should a company along the river in Ohio be able to just dump its sewage into the river? No, there needs to be regulation about that. So let's be smart about it, and not, but because the liberals are for regulation and the conservatives are for innovation, then we get over-regulation and over-innovation, and we're all screwed because of it. So if we get out of our boxes and we actually are able to talk to each other and realize that, oh, maybe there's some truth to both sides, and we can actually come up with a common sense solution like democracy was meant to achieve, then we actually solve the problems. And we used to do that in this country, at least on the environment, and I think we can do it again.
Well, and maybe this is a good time to ask that question about partisanship, because I wonder how much within your own movements does it matter if the person you're standing shoulder to shoulder with is of the same political party? Like, you may, as the top of the food chain, think, oh yeah, we should all be together, this is a bipartisan movement. But do the people in the movement feel the same way, or is there some antagonism towards the Democrats working with Repubs in the trenches?
Well, I think it's changed quite a bit. I mean, that's what I've seen. When I started Moms Demand Action in 2012, about a quarter of all Democrats in Congress had an A rating from the NRA. A quarter of all Democrats in Congress. And I can remember just a few months after the Sandy Hook school shooting, there was a bipartisan bill that would have forced federal background checks on all gun sales called the Manchin-Toomey bill. And it was very moderate, very common sense, and I was sitting in the Senate gallery when it failed by a handful of votes, including several Democratic senators. And we decided that what we were going to do was pivot to doing this work in school boards, city councils, and state houses, and that we were going to have to change the way that Democrats in particular felt about this issue. I can tell you that we would show up in Moms Demand Action. We had red before Donald Trump did, and so we had our Moms Demand Action shirts on, and we would show up, for example, Mark Warner. He had an A rating from the NRA. He had voted with them on all their their gun extremist legislation, and we would just show up at his fundraisers and his house events and corner him and say, look, you have a choice. We can have your back or we can have your job, but you are going to stop voting with the NRA if you want to continue to have your seat in Virginia. There had never been that kind of pressure from our side. There had only been that pressure from gun extremists and NRA members for so long, and that really changed the dynamic. Today, not a single Democrat in Congress has an A rating from the NRA. Now, that might seem great, but the problem is the other side, Republicans have gone to the extreme right on guns, right? So there's this huge chasm between Republicans and Democrats, particularly in state houses. Many of the Republicans in state houses are gun extremists. They actually don't believe, people like Lindsey Graham would say to us behind the scenes, you'll win someday. We're on your side. We can't say it publicly, but you'll win someday. I think a lot of those people have been replaced with people who believe that we should have unfettered access to weapons of war for all civilians. And so that is something we did not count on when I started Moms Demand Action. Guns have really become an organizing principle in the conservative party, which is guns are a way to get, in particular, young men in the door. They're a way to raise money. They're a way to excite them about a whole host of other issues that have nothing to do with guns. And so in many ways, it's become a cultural issue, and I'm not quite sure how to solve that, except to say Moms Demand Action considers itself a nonpartisan or a bipartisan organization. We give a survey to all lawmakers to say, do you support background checks? Do you support disarming domestic abusers? And regardless of what party you're in, if you answer the survey the right way, we will give you our endorsement as an organization. The problem is fewer and fewer Republicans want that endorsement, and more Democrats do, right? And that is the issue with polarization. And I think a lot of that, we were talking about algorithms. When you look at where Russia spent all of its money in the last two elections around influencing Americans through the algorithm, a big part of it was guns, because it is a place where we're so polarized. And I think if we had more conversations and not just sort of these online debates, we could make more progress. But it is all about the grassroots, right? I mean, it is about people insisting that their Republican lawmakers, not just their Democratic lawmakers, vote the right way on this issue. I mean,
yeah, I completely agree, and I think the algorithms are our adversaries' best tool, because they love that we're as divided as we are, and they prefer for us to become more divided because we don't solve any problems. We become super weak as a nation the more that we go down this path, and the more stagnant we become and actually start retracting towards a bad direction. And we're all feeding into that, and we have to stop it. And your question, like, is it problematic for you to align with people on the other side? I've actually started to realize that I would prefer to be associated with Democrats just to prove the point that this is okay. Like, I'm glad that I'm up here with Shannon. That's what I'd prefer, because that's the future of the country again. And I don't need to be in the echo chamber that I once was. And honestly, I've just stopped caring about labels completely. If I could rewrite this book, I wouldn't have even called it that. Because my girlfriend's a liberal, ardent liberal. My sisters are liberal. My parents are conservative. I really don't give a shit. Okay? I love them all deeply. And the reality is, and this isn't just some kumbaya stuff, they actually agree on a whole lot. But we've been, again, told that we have to fit into these boxes, so they have to be called a liberal or called a conservative, or what if they were just called a human that has a belief based on the experiences that they've had in their life? That's what we all are. And when we try to, like, feed into an algorithm or have the algorithm, like, the algorithms are controlling us. They're convincing us that we believe something just because we are reading it. And if I agree 100% with Ted Cruz or 100% with Bernie Sanders, I'm probably not thinking for myself. So why are we being fed that? We're being controlled. And I am a free thinker. I'm pro-choice. I'm also pro-capitalism. I don't care. We have to be willing to have our own beliefs and have them, quote unquote, why are they contradicting? Like, I believe those things because of experiences in my life that have led me to believe that, not because I'm beholden to somebody's powerful regime that says that I have to believe X, Y, or Z. So I don't care that I'm with a liberal on stage, and I don't care if I'm with a conservative on stage. I don't care if I sit down with AOC or if I sit down with Donald Trump. I'm going to sit down with anybody who's willing to sit down with me. People got so angry at me earlier this year when I tried to work with Donald Trump on an executive order for the environment. They're like, you're just trying to greenwash the environment. You're a fake environmentalist, all this stuff. I'm like, no, I'm trying to get the current president of the United States to buy into conservation. What do you want me to do? Sit on my hands? And the same thing would be true if I was sitting up here with you. People would call me a fake conservative because I'm sitting up there with a liberal and I don't hate her. So, like, what is wrong with us, right? We've completely lost the plot. We've completely lost humanity. And I can guarantee you that that's exactly what the adversaries want. Mm-hmm. But most importantly, it all hurts each one of us the most. Mm-hmm. Because we're all worse off because of it. And people can't believe that I'm speaking in California. Literally, I'll tell people that I'm going to speak in LA, and they're like, oh man, Benji, that must really suck. And I'm like, no, it doesn't. But I grew up in Wisconsin, and I told somebody in Seattle that I went on a date with that I grew up in Wisconsin, and she's like, what state is that in? And I was like, oh my God, it is a state. And they're like, oh, the one above Colorado. I'm like, no, that's Wyoming, different W state, okay? And they're like, oh, you got out, thank God. I'm like, no, I actually loved Wisconsin, okay? Like, it was a great place to grow up. So, like, we just completely don't understand each other. We're as interconnected as we've ever been, but as disconnected as we've ever been. We gotta fix it.
I appreciate all those thoughts. And one of the questions that I had is, you said if you were to rewrite this book, you would have had maybe not used the word conservative. I don't know if you guys in this room know it. You co-founded Turning Point.
Yeah.
You worked closely with Charlie Kirk. You were a famously conservative person. And to hear you say, which I applaud, that you get more done working together than you do working in your own echo chamber. What kind of got you to take that kind of journey? Because it's something that I think a lot of people would like to do, but feel like maybe they can't.
Well, I have really good parents, and my parents early on were like, Benji, because they're not political, and so they don't have the incentive to be political, and they were just kind of like, why are you doing what you're doing? Are you doing it for yourself, or are you doing it for something else? And the answer that I wanted to say was not for myself, right? And I really wanted to build a better country, and I cared a lot about the environment. And so my parents' advice was, then you should do what actually does the most impact for the environment and for the country, not what's best for you. If I was doing what's best for me, I wouldn't be trying to start a nonpartisan environmental movement in the year 2025, okay? But I try to wake up every day and see what the most impact I can make, and feeding into the polarization is only impactful positively for me and hurts everybody else. And that was a realization that I have come more and more to over the years. when I was actively helping found Turning Point USA, I was in high school. This was like 15 years ago. So a really long time ago. And it was sort of meant to have a different mission, vision, and that's a totally different conversation. And so I ended up splitting from that. But I did go to battle with you on Twitter because I thought that was fun and like it got me attention, right? And it probably got you attention. We probably got followers over it. But what did it do? Like nothing. Actually nothing. I would rather be behind the scenes and also try to drum up a cultural movement that's not about me but about the mission than be out in front and have my own podcast and try to make a name for myself because I'm just trying, like, to what end? Like, what is that doing? So I'm totally fine with cultural leaders, but right now the only way that you get rewarded for leadership is to divide, and I'm not interested in that. So I'm not going to do it. So I want to rally people around the mission of making the environment nonpartisan, and I want to work behind the scenes to try to make as much happen as I can. And those are the two things that I wake up every day, and like I'm more and more confident that that's the right approach. There were a few years there where I woke up and I was wondering if I was doing the right thing. Now I wake up every day and I'm wondering if I'm doing enough. But I always know when I wake up every day that I'm doing the right thing. I never question that, and my parents are really integral in helping me realize that.
Understood. The question I have that goes back to you, Shannon, which is based on what Benji's talking about. You grow movement better if it's more inclusive. You built an organization from one angry mom to millions of people. How did you do that? How did you do that? The context of our conversation is taking your passion to scale. How did you get it from that one person to such a huge movement?
Well, I think that women are in many ways the secret sauce to organizing and activism in this country. I mean, if you go all the way back to Prohibition, it was really women when men allowed them to talk about this issue because temperance was seen as a Christian value. You couldn't put that toothpaste back in the tube. I mean, women have been on the front lines of activism ever since. And I just had this intuition. I went to bed just in tears the day of the Sandy Hook school shooting. And at some point during the night, that sadness turned into abject rage. And I woke up the next morning and I thought, okay, what can I do? I know how to create a Facebook page. I had 75 Facebook friends. I was not a social media phenom. I was not on Twitter. But I just thought, how can I just have this conversation with other women online? And in 2012, Facebook was very big with middle-aged women. And my 75 friends shared it with their 75 friends and on, and it was one of the first examples of something that went viral. And we came together. Women walked out of their jobs the day of the Sandy Hook school shooting, right, to volunteer full-time with Moms Demand Action. I met all of these amazing women from all over the country, perfect strangers who helped me get Moms Demand Action off the ground because they brought different skill sets than I had. And my goal was always to bring what I knew to bear, communications, but to let other women lead. And when we created these chapters, the model was a chapter leader in the middle, and she was surrounded by other women mostly. There were some men, but women who did everything from religious outreach to membership to data entry. I mean, you name it. It was very, there's a lot of type A women. And created the structure that allowed women to come in. And, I think what I noticed over the years was that the key to a successful organization, whether it's in your community or it's nationwide, is that there's always, and you never perfectly achieve it, but there's always a balance that you're trying to achieve between being top down, which if you're too top down, it becomes too controlling, and bottom up. And if it's too bottom up, it becomes chaotic, right? So there's this fine line between control and chaos that you're trying to straddle, and you want it to be both. And we just were able to kind of achieve that balance. And I will also say, it is not hard to get volunteers to come into an organization like Moms Demand Action. It is difficult to get them to stay. That's why there's no grassroots movement, for example, for Planned Parenthood, right? Think of another organization that has a huge grassroots movement. Sierra Club might be one of them, but Moms Demand Action has 11 million supporters. And the reason for that, we wanted to ask our volunteers why they stayed. And so what we found out were two things, and I think these are broadly applicable to life. The first is they felt like they were winning. So when people, you take on the largest, most powerful special interest in the country, like the NRA, you're going to lose a lot, and we did. But we told our volunteers that a loss was really ultimately a win. Maybe you grew your chapter. Maybe you learned something about the legislation. You did something that will help you win the next time. And we would celebrate every single win, no matter how small. You know, you got a city council to pass a resolution in honor of Gun Violence Prevention Day. That's a huge win. We're going to celebrate that. When people feel like they're winning, they feel like it's a good use of their time and they stick around. The second thing that these women told us was that they felt like they found their people. So again, going back to like shared values, abilities, and desires, when you meet other people, and I think, you know, post-pandemic, given the polarization, given social media, people are looking for connection. People are looking for meaning. People are looking to find their community members. I mean, do you know your neighbors? I don't know my neighbors, right? When you think about where you live and whether you're interacting with those people, it's not something that for the last decade we've done a lot of. So when people find their people, they want to show up, they want to keep contributing, they want to make sure those people are in their lives. And so I think that is sort of the secret sauce.
As you're saying those things, it's making me reflect on your book, because you talked about, now you're saying feel like you're winning, find your people. In the book you talked about the radiate the positivity. You talked about fake it till you make it sometimes as a leader, and to gather and lean on supportive people. So those things that you've learned the hard way made it to the book, and I wanted to note that, because it comes from experience,
yeah.
Right? And I'm wondering, as she's showing that stuff, Benji, if you're thinking about building nature's nonpartisan, you've asked on your website, it says you're seeking 1 million Americans across the political spectrum to join in asking elected leaders to prioritize common sense environmental solutions, not partisan politics. Your movement is also growing to major scale. How are you building that organization to reach the 1 million people? And are your strategies similar to the ones that you heard Shannon share?
Yeah, I think that they're very aligned, but we're really trying to do something from a cultural perspective and make it relevant for people and fun to be environmentalist again. Like, you know, think of environmentalism, I'm overgeneralizing, but you think of a Prius driver, and you think of you think it's kind of like dry and archaic, and like it was relevant in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but like what is meeting the moment of today's needs, and what movement is there that's enjoyable to be a part of for the environment, and also not polarizing and fear-based and saying like, oh, the world's gonna burn. It's like, oh, we have an opportunity ahead of us if we can solve these challenges to build a better world and to build a better conservation movement. So we're trying to do it from a culturally relevant way. We're gonna launch a huge campaign early next year with major celebrities that you would never expect to be standing next to each other, with politicians that you would never expect to be standing next to each other, with two activists who you'd never expect to be standing next to each other, talking about the issues and figuring out, like, creating a demand in America for our leaders to prioritize those solutions. I think to the 2024 election, both Kamala and Donald put a huge emphasis on who's winning the influencer war, right? Like, when Trump won, it was like he had Joe Rogan and Dana White and that famous golfer on stage with him and whatever, and Kamala was all, trying to go on Call Her Daddy podcast and all that stuff. Like, who's culturally relevant does win. What if we made environmentalism cool and culturally relevant? Like, this is part of the American ethos. You cannot run for president and say that you don't support the troops or veterans in some way. We should make it so you can't run for president without saying that you have an environmental agenda. There's just no way. We won't support it. And actually, it's so much so that you want to be part of it. Like, you want to be associated with those celebrities. You want to be associated with that movement because it's fun and exciting. And I think this moment of political polarization has really opened up a door. If there's one issue that people could start to work together on again, in my opinion, it should be the environment. And this is our way of saying, hey, if you're sick of the polarization, or if you want a new environmental movement, or both, we're going to be the home for that. And so we don't have all the answers today. I love the fake it till you make it. Like, people are like, so how are you going to do it? I'm like, I don't freaking know. Like, I'll know more in a year, and then I'll know more in 2 years, and then hopefully in 50 years I'm looking back and I'm like, yeah, I knew what I was doing the whole time. But that's never true, right? So, I think about the biggest brands in the country. You look at like how Amazon took over Barnes & Noble, and you look at how Uber took over taxis. Like, when you start these new movements or these new companies or these new leadership opportunities, you don't really know exactly how you're going to get there, but you build it based on what people want. And so what we're doing right now is we're figuring out who people listen to, why they listen to them, and what issues would they want to get engaged on. And what we found is that people care about local issues. Like, if you live in the Great Salt Lake, you're concerned in that region, you're concerned about the Great Salt Lake. If you live in LA, you're worried about wildfires and smog and water quality, right? So there's different environmental issues in each region, but the reality is everyone has the same end goal, that they want clean air and clean water. So how can we tap into the things that people care about and then help them advocate for it instead of like saving the polar bears or saving the world? Like none of us individually is going to save the world, but collectively we can. But we can if we do the things in our own communities that make sense.
I like the emphasis on collective action and hyperlocal. And in a lot of ways, it maybe reflects your own journeys, because what started out as one person grew to many, many millions of people. But I wonder too, like, for that flame, there are people who are looking to take that initial spark and immediately put it out. And both of you have had your share of threats. And despite the threats, you've persevered. I'm just thinking about so many people on this USC campus and throughout the world who have deep passions, who want to make a big difference. But once they hear, oh, but someone's going to threaten my kids, they're going to threaten my own life, like, no, I don't want to deal with that. But you have persevered despite it. And Jen, I remember reading in your book about the police officer who said, when you told him about the death threats you were receiving, he said, this is a quote, "Well, ma'am, this is what you get when you mess with the Second Amendment." And I was shocked by that. Benji, in your book, you talked about how you had to switch schools, that you were teachers responded punitively to you by giving you poor grades, at least in one class, because they didn't like what you were saying, and you're constantly targeted. So how do you deal, that's my question, how do you deal with the people who are looking to extinguish your flame, to make you scared, and not lead a movement as you have?
When I started Moms Demand Action, I mean, I had the Facebook page. I had no idea that I would become a public figure. So my phone number, my email, my home address, everything was out there, right? And that was great on one hand because it helped women reach out to me and get involved and plug into Moms Demand Action. But within hours, the threats of death and sexual violence to me, to my family, to my kids began. And they would DM me, they would call me, they would send me threatening emails, and then they started driving by my house, and I was getting like those Son of Sam letters where, they cut stuff out of the magazines. And I thought, okay, well, I'm going to call the police and just explain what's happening, and he'll keep, an officer will keep an eye on the house. So he comes to my house and I explain what's happening, as you said. He said, well, that's what you get when you mess with the Second Amendment, ma'am. And it was really in that moment that I realized, okay, I'm either going to have to back down or double down. And, I have a choice to make, because I was afraid, and I think anyone would be, but I also knew that if I lost my kids to gun violence, I have nothing left to lose. And so it was really in that moment that I realized, okay, I'm just going to have to figure out the best strategy to address this, in my own mind. And I had I had security throughout my 11 years, and he wasn't armed, but his job was to find the closest hospital in case something happened to me, to take me to immediately. And so it was frightening, but it wasn't just me, right? Our volunteers would show up at events and marches and rallies, and they would be surrounded by mostly men with AR-15s, even though they had kids and strollers. And what we realized was that actually set an example. It showed the rest of America what open carry looks like, and the fact that it was legal in more than 40 states to have no background check and to carry, an AR-15 into Starbucks. And so it served a purpose ultimately, but I do think it maybe contributed to the polarization in that it really excited the right to bear down even more into that. But I get asked all the time by women, I think because women have been seen differently in society, and we have all these shoulds that we have to do, we get very triggered, shame and guilt around blowback. If someone thinks that we're doing something wrong. And I've had so many women say to me, I just wish I had a handbook for the blowback that I can expect if I do something that is daring or courageous. And I interviewed over 70 women for the book, and I got to interview experts like Kristen Neff, who is an expert in self-compassion. And what I learned was really there's sort of 3 ways to deal with blowback. You may not start an organization and get death threats, but if you do something differently, you might get a comment from your mom or someone in the pickup line at your kid's school. So the 3 things to look at, first of all, is who is giving you the feedback? Who is this blowback coming from? Is it someone's opinion that you value? For me, it was like extremists living in their mom's basement, so I didn't really care. Is is what they're saying true? Can you separate what is valuable to you? You know, I had a lot of people give me feedback when I started Moms Demand Action. Some of it was helpful, some of it was very sexist, so I had to figure out, like, how do I separate the two? And then third is, like, sitting with those feelings of discomfort. When you do something that people don't appreciate or don't condone, you have to ultimately decide whether you can be comfortable with that and not be triggered by feelings of guilt and shame. And I do think blowback is a really big issue, particularly online. And we were talking about the algorithm. Like, I'm watching this Taylor Swift album come out. Are you all seeing all the dialogue around the Taylor Swift album? I mean, that is not normal dialogue about a new album. It is much more coded, it is much more political, it is much more divisive. And so if you wade into any kind of issue that is like that, and these days everything is, it can be a Taylor Swift album, or it can be gun safety, or it can be climate, you have to be prepared not just to have the hard conversations with people who don't agree with you, but to address how people feel about you and the things that they say to you.
Same question to you, Benji, about how you persevered despite the threats, and then we're going to go to your questions, so think of them.
Yeah, I mean, the first time I got a death threat was my freshman year of high school, and it was over the phone at my family's landline. It was not even online, and it was from somebody who was from my high school. Mm-hmm. So I had to go to school every day knowing that somebody called me from my high school telling me that they wanted to kill me. So I actually brought a knife to school every day, obviously illegally, throughout high school. But that was actually from the left. And then in college, it was 2016 was my freshman year. So it was the first time Donald Trump ran, and I was against him as a conservative, and the alt-right came after me, and they put posters all over campus with my face on it, with my phone number, with my address, and they had actually put fake tweets of mine that made me look super racist, and they were trying to get people to come after me there. And then there were tweets like, we're going to come find you at UW and hurt you and all this stuff. And so what I realized was two things. One is the worst thing you can do is to give those people the attention that they want. So the alt-right wanted me to go on CNN or whatever and talk about how they were coming after me because it would give them more relevancy. But the next best thing that they want you to do, so they either want that or they want you to stop. And so you can't feed into either one of those. You can't give them the attention that they want, but you also can't stop. And that's, now what I've really started to do, which I'm still not perfect at by any means, is to take all feedback as feedback, criticism and applause. That you really have to check with yourself how you're feeling rather than what other people are feeling. And so not to get too excited when people are like, Benji, you're the best, thank you so much for doing whatever, but also when they say, Benji, you're the worst, you should go kill yourself, right? Like, literally, like, those are the two things that you hear, and it's like, which one do you believe? It's like, you just take them, you hear them, you acknowledge them, you take what you need from it, maybe things that are valid, valid criticism, or trying to gauge where people are at, and then you just keep moving on and not dwell on it. But I also don't think it's like, I don't really love that that's the way the world is, and so I don't think it's like, oh, if you get into this, you should expect to have to deal with that. But unfortunately, that is sort of the reality of politics today, and so this isn't like, not everyone's meant to be like an activist that gets these threats. It's like, and that's why I've been trying to lead from a vision of positivity and nonpartisanship, because I found that that's where the majority of Americans want to be at. And when you're feeding to the extremes and you get the most hate, you're actually like, yes, you shouldn't be getting that hate. Like, yes, Charlie Kirk shouldn't have been shot. But like, there is a real issue with the more polarizing you are, the more pushback you're going to get. But like, regardless of how many threats you get, like, how many problems is that actually solving? And so it's actually like that's not like the middle is the right place to be at, but how can you be pragmatic and sensible in what you're talking about rather than trying to stoke division? And so I'm not trying to avoid the pushback, but I'm trying to find common ground so that the people who are actually thoughtful want to be part of the conversation. But I think the algorithm really does incentivize the hatred. And I even sometimes will look at like sports, right? You look at like when Penn State fired their coach, like I wanted to go look at their Twitter comments because I wanted to see everyone's reaction, because it's like popcorn, you're just like, oh, I want to watch this. But we got to stop ourselves from like trying to feed into that all the time, because at the end of the day, the most difficult conversations, the most important conversations are the ones offline. And like the average person would not come up to you in person and say the things that they've said to us. And so to try to disconnect that reality, which is not a reality online, with the reality in person and like the people in this room, and that's what matters more.
Right. The inclusivity, that mindset is so important. And I think, Shannon, in your book, I remember you had this phrase, you must get comfortable with making other people uncomfortable. And I think that's well said, maybe summarizes both your views. But anyone have a question? If you can, state your question briefly, and I'll repeat it so we make sure it's captured for our video as well.
Hi guys, thanks for being here today. I had a question. You guys have both been activists for quite a long time now, and both have really zoned in on what your passions are. I'm curious about what concessions you guys have had to make along the way. So when you're trying to appeal to both sides, is there ever times where you have to, sacrifice something that you believe in just to like appeal to who you're talking to in one conversation, and then the next day you're talking to a Republican, Democrat, and you kind of like flip-flop, and how you manage that balance?
It's a really good question. So my message
Let me
does...
just repeat the question real
yeah,
quick, just for the video audience here, because they might not have heard, since you're not mic'd, which is the question about concessions and whether or not you sometimes have to make sacrifices for your own cause in order to achieve this greater good, and whether or not, as activists, that's just part of the deal. You have to make concessions sometimes, and if so, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I personally used to make more concessions when I was more partisan. Like, because I would kind of act more like a box than I actually was, just to fit the mold. And like, my message today would be the same as it would be tomorrow if I was talking to a Republican audience. I might focus on different things. Like, I might talk about the amazing conservation heritage of the hunting and fishing community, which is true. But I'm not like going to contradict that the day before. I might just be focusing on different things. But when I was trying to fit a political box, I was conceding all the time. I was like not bringing up things I believed. Like everything I say, I fully believe. Like, and there's nothing that I say that I don't believe. And sometimes that's a problem, right? Because people want you to say the things that fit inside the box. And like when you say you're a capitalist, but you're also pro-choice, it makes everyone upset, right? But like I don't really care at this point. So it's like that's kind of freeing. And I don't know where that's going to end up. But like I think it's actually like accepting that I don't want to make concessions in my activism that makes me feel better about it. And I feel like if more of our community would do that, like I cannot tell you how many conservative influencers I used to know who I knew didn't believe what they said. Like, and I know it's true in the left as well.
Yep.
And like I had a CNN reporter who interviewed me for this big story I was in, and it was all going to be about how we were trying to bring both sides together for the environment. And then the headline was the anti-Greta, how Benji Backer is trying to like end the Greta Thunberg climate movement. And there was nothing I said at all about Greta in the interview whatsoever. And I texted him like, how can you do this? Like, this isn't right. He's like, well, it did the best with our focus grouping. I'm sorry. That's him conceding. He spent days with me out in nature trying to figure out what we were doing with this movement. And he allowed that to happen. He conceded that. So it happens on both sides. Both sides' influencers are lying to us. And I think like the more that we can be free and transparent, like it might be a little bit like uncomfy sometimes because I'm like, yeah, I'm a capitalist. Be like, no. And they're like, but I'm pro-choice. And they're like, yay. And then they're like, oh, what does that mean? But like that's kind of that has been more fun for me. And so I'm trying to live concession free, really.
You know, if you go back to this idea of losing forward that I was talking about earlier, and Benji used the word pragmatic, like I kind of see also concessions as being pragmatic. You know, if you're so dug in on it, it's not a win unless we get everything. And I see a lot of that, particularly on the progressive side, right? So if you don't get everything you want, then it wasn't a win. I can't tell you how many people, we went on, we did a cultural project where we got hundreds of grocery stores to stop allowing open carry inside their stores. And they would say things like, we don't welcome guns in our stores anymore. And some of them didn't put up signs. And all these progressives were saying to me, oh, you didn't win. They didn't put up signage. They didn't ban guns. And it's important to see politics as like baby steps. And I understand that incrementalism is a dirty word. And it's really frustrating, particularly to young people, because the role of young people is to push, push, push. And then the role of older people is to say, wait a minute, I've lived in the system a long time. Let's not let perfect be the enemy of good. And so what some people might see as concessions, I see as pragmatic. And an example I would give is, we got so much pressure to be in favor of an assault weapons ban from the very beginning. And we had moms, volunteers in red states saying to us, if I go into my state legislature right now in 2012, 2013, and I say we are for an assault weapons ban, we will have no credibility. We will have no way to create relationships in the state. We won't even be able to pass things like secure gun storage. And so for a long time, we would not say that we were for an assault weapons ban. And that made a lot of people really angry. And then it was really the Parkland shooting tragedy when we were like, okay, we've got huge nationwide support for an assault weapons ban. We are going to say we support this as an organization. And that idea of top down, too much control, and bottom up, too much chaos, like we were straddling that line for a while until we finally came out in favor of assault weapons ban. But I think also what this gets to is whatever your views are, whatever your policies are, whatever organization you're a part of, if you're not evolving, you are stagnant. You will not survive. You have to listen to the people in your organization. You have to look at where people are in the country and not be so set in your ways that you're not willing to find a way forward.
Completely agree.
Okay, we have time for one last question. I'm sorry, we only have about 4 minutes left, but go ahead.
I'll do it quick. What kind of, not even research, what kind of books do you guys read? What kind of media do like NPR, Joe Manchin? Just kind of what kind of stuff do you collect and are attracted to that's going to help you, decide, where you're at, what you like, what you don't like?
The question is about media consumption. What books are you reading? What websites are you reading? Where do you get your information?
Just quickly, I used to love Twitter because when the algorithm wasn't the way that it is, you could follow like a really diverse group of people and see all their stuff, but now you just see whatever it feeds you. But I really like Google News, actually, because it just synthesizes like the whole country's news outlets, and like it gives you Fox, but it also gives you CNN, and it kind of just gives you, and it also gives you different sources for each story, and so you can kind of see the different ways that people are talking about it. That's what I usually use, and I also try to like make sure that like for every time I see a Republican stance on something, I'm checking to see what a Democrat would say on it, and so like I also try to curate my following like on Instagram or wherever based on that. And now on Twitter, I think at least you can sort it by who you're following versus the algorithm. And so like follow equal amounts of people on all sides because it really gives you a unique perspective. And Google News kind of does that.
Yeah, I still, unfortunately, am addicted to Twitter. Google News I love. But I would also say I'm a huge fan of The Bulwark. If you know Tim Miller, he was a fellow here too. I find it to be a media outlet that tries to look at all sides of something and doesn't come in with a specific viewpoint and try to get everyone to be in that viewpoint. And the other thing I love about The Bulwark, if you subscribe, they give you instant emergency podcasts on every subject that's happening in the country. And I would say that's my main news outlet right now.
Thank you.
Love that. Well, folks, please join me in thanking Shannon Watts and Benji Backer for joining us today.
Thank you.
I'd say we're so grateful for the sacrifices you've made to advance the public good, honestly, and improve the lives of strangers. All right, so thank you for that. Thank you to our audience on Zoom, on Facebook Live, and those of you watching on YouTube and listening on the Let's Find Common Ground podcast. Remember, on October 22nd, we're going to have our next virtual conversation. It's going to be with USC nonprofit leaders who are also making positive social change. On October 29th, CPF co-director Mike Murphy will discuss Latino voters with former CPF fellow Mike Madrid, current CPF fellow Helen Torres, and potential future CPF fellow Chuck Roca. And finally, save the date of November the 18th, when Bob Trum and Mike Murphy will host our annual Warsaw Conference here at USC. Now, that's where the Democrats and Republicans are going to fly from all over the country to be here in Los Angeles to share their insights with you. The theme of that conference is America 250. Are we a young or old democracy? For those of you in the room, I encourage you to stay. We have books that Shannon and Benji have agreed to sign. You don't have to pay for them. These are giveaways, so hang around, have some pizza if there's some left, get a book signed, and otherwise, thank you and fight on.
Thanks for being here, everybody.
Thank you.